Hey, Tinanim, Wanim Kulu, Wasahonimim. My name is Jacob Metters. I'm Mechoopda, Maidu, Northern California area, what we call Northern California now. This is my exhibition, and it's built on the sacred here at Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art. And thank you for joining us. Appreciate your time. And we're going to have a little discussion with Dr. David Martinez, professor at ASU and AIS, and Alex Soto, the director of Labriola at ASU. Labriola is a Native American library studies, part of the ASU library web, I guess. And we'll do introductions separately. And I will start with Alex, and then we'll go to Dr. David Martinez, and then we'll start our discussion.
Skukudinik anya not juki Alex Soto ana object wasik Tohono O'odham object. So good evening, my name is Alex Soto, originally from the Tohono O'odham Nation from the community itself, as mentioned, director of the Labriola Center.
Good evening, my name is David Martinez. I'm an associate professor of American Indian Studies here at ASU. I've been at ASU since 2007. However, my career began at the University of Minnesota in fall of 2000. So I've been in American Indian Studies for quite a while. More importantly, I'm Akimel O'odham, Hia Ced O'odham, and Mexican. I'm enrolled in the Gila River Indian community. And I write and publish in the field of American Indian intellectual history. I do a little Indigenous art history as well, and a lot of O'odham studies. So thank you.
And before we get started, I wanted to just sing a song in appreciation for you being here, for your ancestors as well, who are always with us, just to get this started off in the right way. Hey yo yo, hey kona kona, 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 hey yo yo, hey kona kona. Hey yo yo, hey kona kona, hey yo yo, hey kona kona. Hey yo yo, hey kona kona, hey yo yo, hey kona kona. Hey yo yo, hey kona kona, hey yo yo, hey kona kona. So appreciate everybody visiting us through the internet, and thank you. And I don't know where everybody's coming from, but you know, we've got ancestors and coming from many places, and we've got cousins over across the way, across the water, and on the islands, and we've got cousins to the north and east, south, and west of us, and just to say hello to you and thank you for visiting us. And we're going to kind of keep this discussion about the work pretty open. I have two well-respected scholars with me, and it was really important for me to have them here because they're from this land, this desert land that many people are thriving on. As amazing as that sounds, right? A desert, right? But we have people who've been here for thousands and thousands of years, and not only thrived here, but knew how to take care of this land, this relative, really, right, for a long time, and probably the best way possible. And haven't seen anybody take care of it any better, for sure. So we're gonna kind of talk about that because, you know, this land is sacred to us people, us indigenous people, whether it's here in the desert or up north where my people are from, and or even out on the islands and the water and the animals. And so you think about what's sacred for indigenous people, and then you think about what's sacred for the colonial kind of narrative and the colonial people that have come here to kind of occupy this land, right? And how that colonial idea of what's sacred transgresses into really the treatment of this land. And so, you know, and it's built on the sacred. First for me started with this idea of reading different books about how sacred places that were very important for Indigenous people, there's churches that were built on them, and how the Christianity was then supposed to like take place over top of Indigenous ways of believing, and then it kind of started to think about boarding schools, and then it started thinking about rights that Indigenous people didn't have for a long time to practice their own ceremonies, and how that slowly started to unfold over time, and us having the right to do that and on our own land. And so this work, we have a dirt floor, and the dirt floor speaks a little bit to a place of prayer, ceremony, but more importantly, a place of healing. And one of the things I shared with these gentlemen is, you know, when we start talking about these different things in our history and the land and how it's treated and the people, how it's treated, and the animals, how it's treated, and how that's so important to us to do it the right way. And because these things take care of us, right? So we have to take care of them. And there's a lot of trauma that comes with that, and having this kind of way of trying to have a place in the work that creates some space for healing, even though we're talking about some difficult situation, you know, things. And then, and also that, you know, in a somewhat of a selfish way, as an artist working through this stuff, I need that as well. I need to have a place that I've given myself to heal as well, or allow myself the room to do that. And so there's reasons why this dirt floor is here. There's multiple layers of why a lot of things are developed in this installation. I hope some of you have been able to see it. Yeah, I don't know if there's any first takes that you gentlemen might want to talk about, or if there's any like particular parts, details in this exhibition that speak to you, that you feel like is an important thing to address.
Well, if I may begin, one of the things that struck me about this exhibit was the earth floor. There was this bringing in the outside to the inside of the museum. And so it struck me for the simple reason that I hadn't seen this before, you know, in an exhibit. The land itself, you know, is something that I think for the Western imagination, you know, is a backdrop, you know, it's the foundation on which to build, you know, the institutions, the icons of Western civilization. And so it's easy, such as in a museum, you know, to forget what this place sits upon, where it rests. So this earthen floor, you know, amazed me for the simple reason that something as pervasive, something as commonplace, yet something so profound, you know, as the earth itself made its way into this space. And you made us think about it. You know, you made us think about, well, why is this here? Why is an earthen floor part of an artistic expression? It's like, well, when Indigenous people talk about the sacred, when we pray to the sacred, when we evoke, you know, the sacred, you know, when we're looking for help or medicine, ultimately we're trying to connect to the earth, you know. And so I just think that, you know, it's amazing. And you have to visit the exhibit to understand what I'm saying, the way in which entering the space and this earthen globe on the floor, you know, it just kind of opens up a space within a space, you know, that I think is transformative. And so it compels everyone to think about what is the sacred. It's one of those philosophical questions
Sure,
that
yeah.
you know you can spend the rest of your life answering. You should spend the rest of your life thinking about it. But suffice it to say, you know, this image, this experience that you created, you know, connects people, connected me in a way with this, with the sacred that as many Indigenous art exhibits as I've seen, you know, didn't connect me to the earth in the way that this one does.
I think for myself, a couple feelings that resonate. One, just seeing dirt inside a concrete area just takes me back to when I was younger, little guy with my grandparents' house, cells, South Coma, like other areas where although it was a concrete house from the outside, a lot of the houses still didn't weren't paved the inside. I was like 5, 6 years old, and just like to me it was weird, or thinking back, kind of weird, but back then I just thought it was normalized or normal to me just to kind of see a house with a structure, but then it was dirt, and it was partially because that's just how the older adobe houses were at certain points in certain communities. And often communities, I guess we'll say the history of traditional housing to modern housing varies, but at least with my family, that's what takes me back to seeing that, just smelling the water too, just like when it would rain or things like that. So like seeing this in here, you see like a concrete slab, and then you see the dirt. Just like that was my immediate reaction. That's the last time I've been in a space like this. It looks mainly it's concrete, right? You come to the museum, obviously, but then to see that, it was just, I don't know, had like a moment, just reminiscing. But also then looking at the exhibit itself and just seeing all the steps, it just reminds me of just after ceremony around a fire. At night you're just there, and dancing or whatever, just in that space, and then just seeing it. In the morning time, seeing all the footsteps, always trip out when you wake up, see that. So I guess to me, overall with this exhibit, that's what it reminds me now, sitting in this room and knowing that it has, different meanings, and I think for me, I think a lot of Indigenous people, just that memory, like reminiscing, just having those moments, of course, in a ceremonial circle, and an all night, gathering, folks are singing, or just remembering your grandparents, and the structures, the houses they lived in, like to me, that's a sacred memory. And, the older I get, knowing that history, maybe it's not as remembered, so like seeing just dirt just takes me back and just to those times. And, I don't know, I just think it's very powerful to see, for those who can able to attend before it closes. But yeah, it's just, you have to be here to see it.
How do you, I mean, I've had different, when I was kind of planning this exhibition and talking it over with the curator, Julie. Julie's behind the camera right now, but thank you to Julie for being such an amazing curator, and the staff here at SMoCA, just amazing staff, whether it's people at the front door, gallery guards / docents, really, they do everything, and then the people installing this. But one of the questions, was, do we let people walk on it? Are they allowed to, step on the floor? Because I've installed this up in Chico, and then it was not allowed to be stepped on, but there was also a blanket hanging over it, suspended above it, so it made sense. But after reflecting on that exhibition and thinking about that, I started to think, because conceptually the use of that space, maybe people need to step on it, right? And then maybe that should be the best viewing point, for the exhibition is on the dirt floor. How, I kind of wonder, like, as a, because, if you think about the circle, you think about a place where you sing and dance, a place for ceremony, right? This is very much, it starts to feel that even when you're talking about, like, after ceremony, after dancing, and you see the footsteps and everything like that, and the dust that comes from that, right? And people coughing after like third, fourth day because dust, and someone's always out there trying to spray it down with a little hose or something. But, you know, inviting people to step into this space, even though it isn't, you know, we're not singing, dancing, and doing that here. This is not that space, but it's conceptually, it makes you think about that, right? You know, how do you respond to that as allowing like viewers to come into that space?
When I visited this exhibit about 2 or 3 weeks ago, you know, and I make my way around the different points, you know, of this circular exhibit, I noticed the footprints that were there. Of course, there's numerous footprints, and there was a docent in the gallery with my wife and I wasn't sure if the footprints were due to people getting to walk across the space, or if you had, as an artist, put those there. Yeah. So I asked the docent, is it okay to walk on that? And of course, he said yes. And I guess a couple of things I think of when I think of that moment. One is that my hesitancy to just help myself and walk in, you know, signifies for me that when I entered this space and I saw this earthen circle, I felt like it's something that I couldn't just transgress without getting permission.
Yeah.
But once I had permission, you know, as simple as it was from a docent as opposed from a medicine person, it changed my perspective on the exhibit itself. I saw it from a point of view that I'm sure you intended viewers like myself to see these images from. And I think that's when the exhibit intellectually, artistically, spiritually started making sense to me. You know, because there's something, I don't want to use the word magical, but for lack of a better term, there's something magical. I will use magical because it's going to help me in this sentence. There's something magical about standing inside of a circle.
Sure, absolutely.
It's an archetypal experience, if you will. And so I'm sure that one can come up with numerous examples of sacred traditions, indigenous traditions all over the earth, where at some point in their ritual or their ceremony, you know, somebody's in the middle of a circle, you know, and they're basically in the middle of the universe. Sure. They're in the middle of creation. And so to not get too dramatic about it, getting to stand inside of your circle put me in the middle of creation, you know, and naturally I thought about my own tradition's creation story. And certainly given where we're at, that's probably a natural thing for me, you know, but it made me wonder about your people's creation story too. Not that I'm trying to coax you into reciting. Well, you know, if you want to indulge us, you know, by all means. But it made me want to know more about your nation, because you were sharing something with us on our land. And I felt like, you know, I was being beckoned into your world, but without knowing your stories, you know, that narrative tradition, that narrative world was left as a mystery to me. But it's a tantalizing mystery. And, you know, I think that's one of the nice things about this exhibit. It makes you want to learn more. As part of, I think, the objective here, which is to get us to think in as many ways as possible what the sacred is.
Yeah. Well, to touch on the second part of your question around just the user or the person coming in, check out the space, you know, from a non-Indigenous perspective, someone who sees the dirt as, you know, outside only, or sees it as something that's not developed or finished. I think based on how this setup is, not knowing the same thing like Dr. Martinez mentioned about stepping on it, because when I came in, I was curious too, to the same point. But just to like for me, at least, to see this and the memories I mentioned earlier, it just takes me back into that mode, and I think for a non-Indigenous person or someone who's still, finding their roots, we'll say, I'm curious, how that would be for them. What comes to mind, what memories, are thought of and so on. Because, with me, just thinking about it, just that experience coming in now, even sitting around it, just kind of even smelling the dirt to some degree, this, has that sensation, those sensory type of, areas to go off in your brain. And so for the audience, I guess, yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you opened it up in that way, to show like, hey, like this is, an area to us that has meaning. Granted, it's up to that individual to kind of identify what that meaning is. But I think with this exhibit, this installation, at least it's that opens the door for that. And then to Dr. Martinez's point about your roots, I'm thinking all O'odham things right now, right? We're on O'odham land. And so I'm how does that look in the forest, in your area in Northern California? And it's just, the dirt there, and like to me, it just feels very O'odham, right? Whether that's in a ceremonial space or even a chicken scratch dance, to see the dirt outside and just to want to sit down on it, or just it's cool outside now in this part of the year. But what does that look like in your area? It's probably more wet, right? It's more muddy. It's not.
It's clay.
Like this.
It has more clay. It feels more like clay.
Yeah, just to kind of know that this is an entry point, for me, but also it's also your way to share, or create that space for others, whether that's Indigenous or folks still learning their roots, or we're all Indigenous somewhere on this planet. But yeah, it's very powerful for that reason. And then also the front end, the structures, which we'll get into more, how that kind of brings more feelings and more thoughts. But yeah, that was my initial thought, was kind of like, what does the non-native population think like when they see this?
Sure. Yeah, it's the touch on that real quick is, I did one of these in Chico, right? And in the University of Chico State, which is literally built on Mechoopda village, right? My ancestors were under this university. Some were dug up and put in boxes and jars, and right, and a whole nother story. But putting this dirt floor really meant a lot in that institution. And I got permission from the tribe because we're building a new roundhouse on our property out there, and we have to remove earth to create that, and we put it aside. So there's this earth that was coming out of the roundhouse. Have a roundhouse not far from that very location that this university's gallery's on, and so they allowed me to use that dirt that was removed, and putting it down back into that gallery was really just a powerful moment. But what had happened was, because it was different, it was more like clay, so it didn't really want to separate really well and just kind of lay down like this dirt does, right? I could put some water to this dirt, lay it down and pat it, and it'll stay pretty nice. And so with this clay, it didn't really want to do that, so I had to really separate and rub and push. And what it was doing, it was exfoliating my skin, and it was exfoliating it so much, because it took a few days to put this thing down, that it was bleeding my hands, and I had to start using different parts of my hand to do it, and then eventually using my left hand to finish it. But I was bleeding into this dirt, and then all I could think of at that time was that our ancestors had put their hands in this dirt and in this water, and nourished themselves with these plants that come from the dirt and the water and these animals for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, we just found footprints in the white sands and go back, what?
23,000.
23,000 years. Yeah. Right? That's not far from here. That's not very far from here. For Indians walking and running back in the day, that's not very far. You know what I mean? And so if you think about that for thousands of years, your actual DNA, the makeup, is really, if you think about it, the land itself from this specific location is encrypted and embedded into you, because it's been in this water, in this dirt, in this land for so long, for ancestors and ancestors for thousands of years, right? I just started thinking that, wow, that's a really powerful thing to think about, for thousands and thousands of years. When you talk about the smell and stuff, like there is when you go back home. For me, like there's a smell, there's something, there's like this taste in the water. There's always something that makes you gonna go, you know, like this place is special to me. There's something about this place that I'm like, I know, not just because I know geographically where I'm at, but there's a feeling and a smell and a taste that you know that you're somewhere very familiar, right? You know, that your body starts to geo map it all on its own, without having to look at your phone and know where you're at, right? What we do now. But yeah, it's the apprehensiveness that I started to have about not just the dirt floor, but allowing people on it when I was processing that made me think, well, if that's uncomfortable. The apprehensiveness started to make me feel uncomfortable whether that was the right thing, which then made me think, I think it's the right thing to do is to let people go on it, because I think that I want them to start to feel some of that, you know, apprehensiveness, because I think, you know, there's protocols, and like you said, like, you know, asking, there's like there's as little as it is, it's kind of like a protocol, right, to get that permission, and knowing that there's ranking in which you're allowed to step into a place, right? Especially, you know, when you're talking about ceremony and you know, the inner circle, the outer circle, things like that. So yeah, I think that uncomfortable not knowing and having to like figure that out and ask that, like that, I think that forcing the viewer into that was something that I wanted them to experience, right? Yeah. And then these on top of each one of these pillars are these busts. There's these artifacts, if you will. They're from Christianity, I would say more specifically Catholicism, I'm guessing. And on them, there are indigenous markings. Like Mary has what we call up north 111s, moku and Aotearoa, but you know, they're tattoos on the chin. So, you know, our people used to have these tattoos, and the women had them on their chin. And, you know, they would tell often like your status in the family, your family in general, or even, you know, where and what village maybe you came from, and which would also, you know, allude to what families you belong to, right? In a lot of ways. And then the men would have tattoos too. A lot of times we had them on the arms, and we'd use them for measurement, for trade, right? And things like that. But for me, you know, indigenizing these pieces was an interesting choice for me, because what was happening is I was going to Goodwills, junk shops, going to these places where there's all this discarded, unwanted items, and that's where I like to get things in my life, and I prefer going there than any store really, except for maybe the grocery store where there's food, and I love food just as much. But I started seeing these objects that represent people's religious belief from the colonial perspective, right? And I started looking at them, and the process was that, you know, these items are commodified, hyper commercialized. They're bought, sold, people possess them, and then they're quite often, when I go to these places, they're discarded, they're unwanted. And I started thinking about, you know, these are objects that represent a way of believing in religion, and from the beginning they're mass produced and commodified, commercialized, they're sold, and then they're discarded, and they become this waste, this unwanted. And this comes from a very Western, Euro-American system of believing. And then I think about the way that the land is being treated, and it's very similar. And then I think about what's sacred for Indigenous people, and how we're just trying so hard to prevent that to continue. And we have, for generations and generations, opposed the way that this sacred land is treated. And I think, how many different generations and ways have we tried to have this discussion? And I thought, well, there, here's a perfect example of why we have such a hard time communicating, because what's sacred or holy is treated one way by this group of people, and what's sacred and holy to us is treated a different way. And there you have a way that this communication starts to break down, right? Where you go, it really becomes a code or a way of like going, well, I don't understand that. I'm not programmed. I'm not conditioned, right? Because we're all conditioned beings. I'm not conditioned to see that, because the way I'm taught to believe doesn't bring that into the conversation, right? Yeah. If from the other, right? And then for us, we're like, well, we're conditioned to take that into account, and so these objects are, and they're also contained. They're the most colonial part of visual imagery that I'm using in here, right? Because we're all conditioned to see different things, and then there's these, and I'm addressing them, I'm indigenizing them, I'm welcoming them into this circle, a ceremony, right? And then, but they're also contained, where the dirt's accessible and you can touch it. It's a part of the art that you can actually, like, you literally can step on it, right? And it gets on your shoes and you can take it home, right? Or at least halfway home. So how, what, I know that you talked a little bit like you wanted to kind of respond to those pieces and how they're kind of addressed in this installation. Where do you want to go with that?
Alex?
I guess to the Santos, it looks like, that are here, you touched on the historical side with Native people and Christianity, and just seeing dirt around these saints, or these or Catholic folks here, that like it does take me back to those memories again. I keep going back to that because I feel, outside of the customs, our beliefs, certain things that O'odham we believe, I think a lot of it is built at a family level, and a lot of it comes from having those experiences on the dirt, whether that's growing up or going to ceremony, or various places outside. So when I see these pillars here, it just tripped me out, because I'm just like, it just reminds me of all those saints you see even outside of, on the side of a road at a shrine. But then I'm like, they're mass produced, and I know a lot of folks do, for those who believe or kind of blend the two, and I think a lot of the Sonoran tribes have done that. It's just always weird to me. It's a commodity, and I guess us, for those who do adopt those ways or aspects of it, we do, I guess, quote unquote, indigenize it. But then it just does really kind of disheartening when you would go to like a store like in Mexico, a Magdalena, Sonora, for example, when they do, the festivities around Kino, that it's just a whole market. You see all these saints and all these ribbons and all these rosaries and crucifixes and all that. And although it is capitalism, it is a commodity, I do see how those families use them and adopt them or indigenize them, or whatever it is, but they take them back to outside, I guess, or back to the dirt, back to the areas that, that's more sacred for us. So at least my interpretation, kind of looking at this, that's what kind of reminds me, just seeing like, or thinking of relatives or grandmas and grandpas, like, those who believe, they hold those items sacred, but they're not in a capsule like this. They're actually outside more, in my opinion, from what I've seen in my family's interactions. And they're held in a different light compared to finding them at Goodwill or finding them at some, random religious shop. But yeah, it is definitely a contrast. And I think for Native people, there's a whole spectrum of the whole Catholicism side to the traditional side, everywhere in between. And, that's kind of my opinion on every family's, every individual has to make those choices, what they adopt, what they don't. It's kind of like a journey to figure that out on a spiritual level. But again, I think for me, I'm so accustomed to seeing this, at least on Tohono O'odham, and I can't speak for all O'odham. I'm just speaking to my experiences, my areas, the villages I come from, the families and the communities, who conduct ceremony, either traditionally or more traditionally, or more with the church, but either way, like, I don't see them locked away in a little capsule. And I think a lot of times the difference when you see that type of, version of Christianity on the res, we make it, we make them dusty, right? We make them dirty. you know, in terms of it's outside compared to like a nice polished church in Phoenix where everything is behind and, you know, kind of away from each other. And there's like these boundaries and borders and things of that nature. And so that's just kind of my initial thoughts, you know, when I saw that. But again, you know, I don't want to speak for everybody's version, you know, of their view, their beliefs. So.
Yeah, there was a lot of thought in those pieces because, you know, like I mentioned before, boarding schools, churches built on sacred places, things that where Christianity has touched us in ways that in history that really affected us. But I also, you know, the encapsulation also made me think about the specimen and how for very, very, very long and still at times we are a specimen for you know, colonial science, anthropology, all that thing. You know, even I talked about like, you know, some of our ancestors still in boxes, still in jars in some of these museums and institutions. And I think about those capsules also kind of, it starts to make it feel the way they're in there, like they're like a specimen almost, right? So there's a little bit of that, like in my mind, kind of a little bit of reversal and studying. And in a way, I kind of am studying it, right? In a way, I'm trying to figure out this way all this stuff has come together and continues to kind of dance around each other. Yeah. David?
Well, my reaction to this part of your exhibit is probably a little different, though not contradictory to what both of you said. The first thing that went through my mind as I was looking at these icons, you know, in these bubbles, these containers, is I looked at it as an alien invasion. That these beings, you know, were descending from a completely different planet, and they're invading this earth that's on the floor here. It also made me think about the difference between a land-based religion and a text-based religion, you know, indigenous sacred tradition and Christianity. Because these icons on these pedestals, you know, it signified for me that Christianity as a faith community is all about what you believe. It's all about what you believe, and so it's about how you, I guess, condition your mind to accept the truths that Christianity has to teach you as a religion. And it's also a hierarchy. So, you know, it's up off the ground. So you get this kind of ivory tower effect that's going on at the same time. It's very different from indigenous ways, which are land-based. You know, it's about, not about what you believe, but it's it's about what you experience, which is very different, which is very different. And so I guess the difference between Christianity and the Indian way is, in the case of Christianity, you know, it's about, you know, listening to sermon, you know, it's about singing a hymn that reinforces your faith. And so it's all about credo and how you identify as a spiritual person. In the case of land-based religion, you know, it's about using your body, such as in dance.
Sure.
You know, it's about, you know, immersing your whole self into a natural space. You know, and so it's more about an experience beyond words. And so you learn your spiritual truth that way because of what you experience going through ceremony. You know, the experience of ceremony reinforces how you understand the world. You know, whereas a text-based religion is more about whether or not you can recite, like catechism, you know, the credos of that faith. Right?
Yeah.
And then the blankets are decolonization. It's what's beyond what these guys represent. It's like there's a horizon beyond this
Speak to
circle of control.
Yeah, speak to that. The blankets. What you know? How did explain that more?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's like to put it simply. Granted, I'm grappling for words a little here. But if you can imagine being on your reservation, and that reservation has a church, and most reservations have churches. Some have a lot of churches, you know, but probably there's going to be one church that's more historically important than others.
Absolutely.
You know, and so that church, you know, from a historical perspective, you know, symbolizes colonization. You know, the invasion of the outsiders that brought in their faith traditions and imposed them on us. So something like this, for me, represents that church on the land. What that blanket symbolizes for me is the mountain that's behind that church. That reminds us who we really are and where we're from.
Yeah.
And so the icons, they get me to think about that history, that colonial history. But these blankets, they get me to think about liberating ourselves from what these other symbols symbolize.
Yeah. I haven't heard it that way before. But when you say it that way, I go, oh, wow, yeah. And well, because, you know, I've always tell people like these blankets, you know, they start about place. To me, you know, painting on these blankets, it's about place. And quite often, like, for me, it was like how, and really the process. So it's really hard to get the viewer to see what I see when I do these, because it's transformative to me as a painter. And what happens is I use a lot of very transparent paint, a lot of it, you know, because I have to use a lot of acrylic medium to get into the surface of the blankets, therefore so they won't crack. So that acrylic medium, and acrylic tends to be, it's basically like plastic paint almost. So it's very elastic. The more medium and less pigment, the more it can bend and not crack and pop. So what happens is you got to use a lot of that, and so the old pattern starts to kind of fade away for the older pattern. I don't know, right? But the blankets themselves, you know, I thinking about place because I'm thinking about, you know, ceremony, putting a blanket down to mark your place, you know, blankets as gift, right? Like the honor to be honored with a blanket, you know, it's still waiting. Everybody out there still waiting, you know, just kidding. But, you know, it's a big deal, right? To be honored with the blanket. So it, you know, I think about those things, but I use these Mexican blankets that you can just buy, you know, on the corner of the market, or some of these, like, you know, kind of cheapy shops here in Scottsdale sell them stacked up. But they make me think about how colonial narratives of place are projected onto us, and how these boundaries, right, are dictated not by us as Indigenous people, because especially you guys, out of all people, understand that, you know, you got relatives that have been separated, continue to be separated by boundaries, right? Having relatives on this boundary that's being created by an outsider. As a California Indian, you know, Spain came and claimed it, and I guess we're part of Spain's empire, and then, you know, then Mexico then claims it, and then the United States claims it and then calls it California, right? And so, like, our identities get shifted by an outsider and their boundaries that they create. And so these blankets kind of, for me, felt like specifically the object of the blanket had these different meanings to me, and that was one of it. But when you talk about the mountain behind it and knowing, that's where we're from, then it starts to even, funny enough, starts to make even more sense to me, right? And this, it's funny when someone else can reflect on the work you've done, and then because there's always these little things about your work that aren't always like connected in your mind, because that's why we keep working on the same stuff sometimes as artists, because we haven't found everything that needs to be found in the work, and we keep playing with it and tweaking it here and there and adjusting it. But then when you say, oh, that's the mountain behind it, it's like, oh, that was profound, man. Like that opened my eyes to my work a little bit, you know what I mean? But it also connected to the idea that I try to move these about place, and I really, originally started painting on these blankets because I thought like what I paint on needs to be just as important than what I'm painting. And I can't just paint on canvas because the canvas means nothing to me, but these blankets mean a lot more to me. And so the structure is more important. But yeah, it's really, thank you for that. Appreciate it. Alex?
Yes, overall, standing in this room, looking at it as a whole, and Dr. Martinez nailed it very poetically and on point with that view of it. But I think we were talking about this recently, Jake, where I think the mountain, the blankets in the background, it just really embodies the complexities. What we were discussing around just these ways of knowing, or beliefs, or whatever word's best to see like all this in one room, right? Starting, to me at least, with the dirt, as we talked about, that to me as an exhibit or as an autumn drew my attention. And then for sure, these pillars, it's like, what are they doing here? All that, but then like seeing everything else around it, and I think to me, especially as a not so young, not so old autumn, navigating these complexities around spirituality or religion or whatever wording folks want to use, as autumn in this area just kind of sums up like a lot of the historical context of first contact, like you touched on, with Spain, Mexico, now the U.S., and everything that came along with it, such as the church. But also our roots are still here. I mean, I think that's what the dirt to me represents. But then knowing that, it's not as simple as, or some folks who may fall under more of the Catholicism, there's always more behind it, or there's always a different interpretation. I think a lot of the Sonoran tribes have illustrate that, with how they blended their customs and beliefs for various reasons. A lot of it was forced out of survival. A lot of it was just because they're Omacais or medicine people, had those conversations at that level of initiation. But, here it just really kind of sums up a lot of that history of first contact in that way. But it looks different in different ways. Some folks might see it from some of the perspectives I shared, reminiscing of relatives, of Santos and how it's placed and all those things. And, that's kind of how my reaction was, just because of my own experience. But then either way, knowing in the background, there's like our indigeneity, right? In this case of the blankets and even the patterns on the wall and other things, which to me are just more encompassing of everything. So even for those who do adopt certain things, it's still native, in some way. That it's not like from the Pope directly or anything, that brand of Catholicism. I think Native people have always found a way to adapt and change it, remix it, whatever word you want to use. But it just depends on the person, again, back to those experiences, those beliefs. And I know, at least for autumn, or Tohono O'odham especially, that's a conversation that's been happening, like, without getting into an AIS 101 or anything in terms of just that history of colonization. It's like everywhere is different. Autumn experiences around what we're talking about look different than, or Tohono O'odham look different than Akimel O'odham. They look different than Hia Ced O'odham. They look different than Dene and Hopi. It's just that interaction. But either way, we've had the remix, adopt, and all those things. But then either way, we're at the dirt. Either way, we have that the sensory, things come into play. And I think looking at this, it just really shows, even though there's these pillars, or as Dr. Martinez put it, these ivory towers here, we're still indigenous. We're still surrounded by it everywhere we look, although we have these eyesores here and they're space invaders and their capsules and all that. That's just how I see it. So.
Yeah. So these pieces are on the pillars, they're actually lined up northeast, southwest, and placed at different heights, right? So the female is high and the largest piece, and the male, Christ, right, is opposite of her, but she faces east. So part of that was that sun rises in the east, and I wanted to honor women in our communities and in a way that like everything starts with them, right? Without them, we have nothing, right? Our women are, I think, the most powerful people in our community by far, and definitely need to be no longer treated the way that they are. I mean, talk about missing and murder Indigenous women and things like that are happening, still happening now, and how our women are being affected. So, I mean, there's a subtlety in that, but I wanted to think about direction, right? And where these things are placed, and honoring direction, and in a way that also honoring the women in our communities. So yeah, there's a little bit of that in the work. Just wanted to make sure that was talked about a bit. And then also the vinyl, the patterns going up the wall, those I thought about two things layered into this concept was one, the pillars inside the roundhouse, because they feel like they're pillars. They feel like they're kind of holding up the roof in some way, because they go completely to the ceiling from the bottom. But also, I also thought about the fire that's always there, right? And there's always that fire, and then there's always that smoke that's coming up. And as we sing and as we dance and as the dust gathers, it carries out. For us, we have a large hole in the top of our roundhouse. So the roundhouse is in the ground about 4 to 5 feet, circular ground, and then there's the earth kind of dome over top of it, and then there's a hole at the top of that. So that's where all that goes. So I think about the different roundhouses have different numbers of pillars. It could be 1, could be 2, but even up to 4 pillars. So, but yes, those patterns kind of using those in that way. Yeah, and then there's willow used in this. There's willow that we use for weaving, and there's actually willow basket pattern under the dirt floor, which is really hard to see. But the idea was that as people walked on it, it would slowly start to show the pattern, which hasn't really happened, unfortunately. So, but some pieces have started to pop up, and so there's pieces of willow that start to show up in the dirt. And then this one figure, the cross is actually removed, and the willow is put in there. And speaking to the willow was, to me, in a way, also talking about how we manage the land, because weavers are healers. Weavers are hold a lot of medicine because their knowledge of the plant life and the amount of time they've got to take care of these plants and nurture them to create good usable material to make a basket, right? And the idea that the water also comes into that when you start thinking about the willow and what the willow does. And if you manage willow enough in some of the waterways, you can create natural kind of fire breaks in our area with that. And I learned that from my sister, Allie Knight Metters, who is, she teaches TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, up in our area. And so I think about, obviously, some of the work she does and the things I learned from her. And so I wanted to bring that in there with some of the basket patterns, but also the willow, and thinking about how we, as Indigenous people, manage the land, and especially the fires in California, if we're Indigenous people allowed to manage the land as we traditionally did, maybe we wouldn't be in a situation. But I think we're ready for Q&A questions and okay, yeah. So if there's anybody, we can continue to talk about the subject, and then if anybody out there in Webland wants to ask a question, feel free to type one in our Q&A thing that we have, and we'll get to your question.
Speaking of question, can I ask you a question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It can happen right here.
Okay. I'm curious about the title. I mean, it's a self-evident title, given what we're talking about here, you know, and it's built upon the sacred. I noticed that the title is in quotes. So is that a reference to an experience you had where that phrase was used, or how did that develop?
I have this fascination with quotes, and I like to use them. I don't know if I'm always accurately using them. I'm not a awesome writer like you. David Martinez is a great writer. He's written many books, and they're all really awesome. So I kind of use quotes only because I've read about how in research books and stuff, how and these churches were built on sacred places, on the sacred. And so it was something that I pulled from, because quite often when I build a body of work, it's actually from reading. It's reading stuff literally like that you write, Fixico writes, all these different indigenous scholars write these really amazing books. And, I read this stuff, and there's certain things that I read that really strike me that I can't stop thinking about, that I sit in bed and I'm just processing some of this stuff. And then so those build my concepts of because to me, art is a discussion. It's a talk like we're doing now. To me, I see it as growing up being dyslexic, I had a hard time reading out loud because I was scared to death, because I knew I couldn't read very well because it would just all look so intimidating. I just couldn't get more than 2 lines without stumbling and fumbling over words and stuff, and then totally freaking out. And then writing was the same way. I get really frustrated and just angry when I write because I just can't communicate what's here because this is what prevents me, is the writing, the spelling. I can't get around words. And so I'm always very enamored and just people who write, I'm like, wow, like they're like next level stuff, right? So I was always forced to make stuff that created the words that I wanted. And so in a way, it's, to me, I see this as a way of kind of conversation and stuff, but that builds my concept, is the writing. And so when you talk about the quotes, it's like, because I was reading stuff about these things. And right. So it is kind of quoted. I couldn't tell you exactly what book or whatever, who said it, but it was in my mind, it was something that someone said, and somewhere where I read it, and it was, and so it in a quote. And it's built on the sacred. And it comes from the idea that, these churches and things were built on sacred places, but then I start thinking about all the things that are sacred to us, and all the things that are being continually built, whether it's a pipeline or a building or what have you, right? On them. And it still continued to be built on the sacred. But for me, like, concept comes first, and then material, medium, and the way to build it and make it usually comes after that, because it's those thoughts and ideas and things that I read that I have to process. And then I'm not going to write a book about it. I'm not going to write a paper to get it published about it. That's out of my wheelhouse. But I can make something for a lot of people to look at and start to contemplate these ideas. Because to me, I don't always, the work I'm making, I really don't have answers with them. There's still questions that I'm still struggling and playing with. It's not like, I can tell you why I did it, but I can't tell you the answer to that why. I can't say that this is a definitive, like, this is the reason why these things are this way, or this is how you fix this. I don't have those answers, They're still open questions to me. And I think the way that I kind of can process these things is to make things, keep my hands busy and make things that continue that conversation, because I'm definitely not going to write anything. You know, it's too, I can't deal with the stress, man. And this is actually no stress. Like it's an enjoyable, like stress reliever is to make something. Yeah. Did we have a question? 3. Okay. Cool. De toi. Oh, I don't know. I haven't been hanging out, regulating the place. I haven't seen any bare feet. Making this whole thing, I was barefooted the whole time and walking on it. And I put a recommendation, kind of, sort of, that, people asked, I told the docents that people asked about wearing the shoes. Like I told the docents, well, the artist always walks on it barefoot. So just to see if we can get him to do it. Yeah. Question 2. Yes, I'll repeat the question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so for many, gosh, how am I going to think? Okay, so the question had a little bit of explanation about Catholic Church and a lot of people they're using the saints in different parts of their religion to integrating Christianity into their ceremony. How did my people do that? I am not aware. When I go to ceremony, it doesn't exist. When I go to ceremony, at least in the roundhouse that I've gone to, it doesn't exist. Are there people in our tribe that go to church? Yeah, there's people who do go to church. They do have churches that they go to and practice Catholicism or whatever, Presbyterian or whatever church they go to. I don't know that much about that, but in our ceremony now, my wife is Yaqui, and I've gone to the Yaqui ceremony, and there's a lot of that, and it's amazing, and it's extremely complex, because you see things, you're like, that's indigenous, and you're like, that's not, that it, like, well, I don't know about that one. Like, it's really complex, and there's so much going on at the same time that I think if I went to every Yaqui ceremony for the rest of my life, there's no way I could decode it. I think there's only certain people that really can, that know, that carry that, but you could tell that it's all coded in there, very, very complex. It's very complex. So I've definitely seen it firsthand in some ceremonies, but in ours, I haven't seen it. Yeah. Okay, so any advice for young Indigenous or artists of color to look ahead and change the narrative? Geez, I don't know, you guys. What do we do with that one? I wish I knew, because I'd already be doing it, right? I wish I already knew what they need to look ahead to do to change the narrative, because if I could tell you that, I would be trying to touch that. Other than I think observation is super important. I think being critical mind and thinking, and understanding, for me, a lot of, because I'm an educator as well and I teach art, is a lot of what I tell students is that we're all conditioned. We're all conditioned beings. Everything's kind of worked in our world to condition us, especially now in this day and age with the technology and stuff. And so being very hyper aware that you are a conditioned being, things are conditioned in you and will continue to try to condition you, right? And the more you're aware of that and critical and think about that, the more that kind of frees you up to try to think differently, to try to think out of the box, to accept it and know that there's just like, that's there. And, you know, from being a young child, it's there. And simple, the most simple way of saying it is, as I tell them, like, stop sign. It's red, it has a certain shape. You know, we can remove the word stop and still put that red sign there, and people will stop because we've been conditioned that that red is an alert, it is a warning, and it is telling you caution, stop. Like, and that's often in nature, right? You see something red, you're like, ooh, I don't know if it's a red spider or a spider with a red belly that looks like an hourglass is a little hesitant to do something, because you're conditioned that that particular black spider with that red, you know. And so these are conditionings that are safeguards, right? They're parts of nature that you've been conditioned to understand, you know, your situational awareness, right? That could save you. But there's also many things, especially living in a capitalistic society, you know, I want you to, it's conditioning for consuming, right? So, but, you know, as an artist, I think these are things to be very aware of and thoughtful about and critical about, because I think it helps you kind of break down barriers and through barriers, and even sometimes just walk around it to build better work, right? Being observant is extremely important, and then understanding that conditioning factor allows you to kind of like look forward, break new boundaries. Okay, well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for allowing us to, or not even, if you don't even allow us to be on this land, maybe you're not, there's probably some people you're kind of like, they shouldn't be allowed on this land, right?
They're not in this room.
Yeah, they're not in this room at least, but thanks for your wisdom and your kindness, for sure. You're great people. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing this to us.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, goodbye, everybody.